Welcome to the Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdie Foundation. Join us as we uncover the art of giving back.
Hey listeners, our guest today is a fascinating individual who not only inspires with his boundless energy, but leaves you in awe as to how he manages to fit it all in. Professor Miles Prince's service to his fields of choice, to his patients and to the community are nothing short of extraordinary. I'm sure that at the end of this discussion you will be informed, inspired and moved. You're an internationally recognised Australian haematologist, a professor of medicine at both Melbourne and Monash universities. You're the professor and director of molecular oncology and cancer immunology at the Epworth Centre for Immunotherapies and Snowdome Laboratories. And you're a haematologist at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, having published over 450 peer-reviewed manuscripts and being awarded a Member of the Order of Australia in 2014 for significant services to blood cancer research, patient care and philanthropy leadership. We're going to have lots to talk about today. Welcome to the Hidden Philanthropist, Professor Miles Prince.
Thank you, and congratulations for pronouncing that probably the best I've ever heard. The cancer immunology, people get very tongue-tied.
That's okay, that's only my first go. I'm going to have to pronounce it a lot of times today. You have an incredibly decorated career and continue to do amazing things. Your dedication to your field of medicine has been well documented and your commitment to your work is unwavering. Before Professor Miles Prince the medical scene, what was life like for a young Miles?
Well, that goes back a long way. So my family's from India initially, and we immigrated here when I was 3. It wasn't long before we moved to Geelong, and that's where I grew up. So grew up in Geelong, didn't come from a particularly medical family. My dad sold life insurance. He was a classic salesman, and I think his favourite book was The Sale Begins When the Customer Says No. And he was about talking to people. I think taught me a lot about just if you want to be focused, and still what I talk about now is that the sharper you are, the deeper you penetrate. So try to be focused on what your passions are about. So I went to school in Geelong and then came down to Monash Uni. Then from Monash Uni, went into medicine at the Alfred. So outside of medicine, my passion was rugby, and I played a lot of rugby. So got a bit of travelling overseas, got a bit of interest with that, and make a bit of a decision. Was it rugby or was it sticking with medicine? Stuck with medicine. And the me before medicine was largely somebody who came from a small town, and coming to Melbourne was a big thing, and it was very focused on family. I met my wife, Fiona, down in Melbourne, and we went overseas for a few years, went to Sydney, went overseas and came back to Melbourne in the mid-1990s, and we've stayed in Melbourne since. I've always basically said Melbourne is my favourite city. It's where I wanted to work, and quite frankly, cancer and immune therapy just happens to be, this is one of the biggest focus places in the world for all the innovation that's happening in the area that I research in, as well as being a clinician.
So Geelong Grammar in Geelong?
I went to Newtown State School, St Joey's, and then won a scholarship to Geelong Grammar. And in fact, it's interesting when we talk about philanthropy is that I often thought, why would people give to, public schools? And I actually realised, well, how did I get there? I got there on a scholarship. And so I wouldn't have been able to join the dots that I can now, having not had the opportunity of somebody saying, let's support and get a kid through on a scholarship. And I did an interview with Geelong Grammar, and we talked a bit about this, and it struck me that supporting scholarships, whatever the point in people's lives are, is probably one of the most powerful things that you can do. And it's really made me reflect, going back, on how important philanthropy is. And so, scholarship boy at Geelong Grammar, and then down to Monash Uni.
And you're an absolute leader in your field. You're a real intellect. Your father was a salesman. When did you recognise that university was going to be for you, and why medicine?
Oh, look, my parents are Anglo-Indian, and focus was education. It was absolutely education. You can give nothing better to your kids except educate them. My dad would have tied me up and driven me to the university and tied me to a desk until I passed and got in. So he said it was just assumed that we would try and get as best education as we possibly could. And so he came out of a science degree himself. It's interesting when you do medicine, because I tell this to my students or people who come to me, young kids, teens, and say, I want to do medicine. I say to them, well, what would you do if you didn't do medicine? And you know what? Most of them choose something that's very outside of the field. They don't say, I want to be a nurse or a physio or a speech pathologist usually. They actually often say, I might want to be a lawyer, or I might want to be a politician, or they say very different things, because what drags people towards medicine is not just the science, it's actually being creative in many ways. So I loved the idea of going into medicine because it was going to be it was about contributing, helping people. And the specialty I've gone into is about looking after people over a long period of time. My sister's a surgeon, and she always berates me because I tell all the young doctors who are choosing a specialty, I say, do you want to speed date your patients, or do you want a long relationship with them? And if you want a speed date, perhaps you should think of things like surgery or ED or ICU or somewhere where it's a short interaction. Whereas to me, it's a long interaction. That's unfair on surgeons because they do know their patients very well. But it is about bringing to both the relationship with the patient, but also what makes me excited is the fact that you are helping people, but you're bringing some true knowledge and true science to all of that. And that's part that sort of fits into what we might talk about later, which is why do we want to bring all these new treatments to people? Because we always want to give people hope.
You've finished your medical degree. You've forged an incredible career now. Why specialise in blood cancer?
I think during medicine in your early years, you end up choosing things that you don't want to do. So you might not want to be an obstetrician. You might not want to be a psychiatrist, radiologist. So I found out very early I really was interested in treating patients where I could make a difference. And I found very quickly seeing patients that had been right on the edge and then had been pulled back from the edge and were able to then get back on their lives was really rewarding. And that was the most important thing. Back in those days, a lot of people with cancers died quite quickly. There were very limited treatments. Blood cancers were a bit different. Leukemias and lymphoma was very treatable and actually potentially curable. So the idea of actually going into this cancer treatment but curing some people, like young kids with Hodgkin's disease, I think really was appealing to me. And then it wasn't soon after that I discovered that there was so much research in blood cancer because the blood's easy to get to. So if someone has a blood cancer, you can actually get their cells very easily, just pulling some blood or doing a simple bone marrow test. Whereas researching some cancers like a brain cancer, you don't get many goes at biopsying someone's brain. So it's hard to make the changes. So one of the big things from blood cancers is that subsequently other cancers have learnt a lot from the discoveries that we've made. So I got very passionate very early on the idea of being able to add research, because a lot of people who think about medicine don't realise, they sort of think you get trained, you learn to operate, and you then go and set up your surgery and you're operating on people. Or if you're a physician, you learn to be a cardiologist and then you learn to treat people's hearts. But there's a big chunk in the middle, in your mid-20s particularly, where you've got the opportunity to learn about research, which is how to run clinical trials, or even more directed research, spend time in the laboratory. And I did my time in Toronto. A lot of people go overseas because I realised that if you want to make those changes, contribute all the way along the rest of your life, you've got to get the basic training. But one of the problems is once you get back from that, to be able to stay in the research, because so many people are trying to pull you apart in every direction, you find that there's limited time to research. And so one of the key things that we've been doing, fast forward to our foundation, is just been to fund people and give them the time in those critical years to support their research, rather than being dragged in as the most junior doctor in the haematology department and you're in charge of the grand rounds and making sure that the residents are trained, actually giving them blocked research time. And that's an enormously productive time, and it sets these people up to do research. So, all those books up there, which are my PhD students, all of them have gone on to become professor at departments all around the world in Australia because they've had that opportunity and someone's given them that opportunity. They've got a scholarship or something along the way, either through NHMRC or through now a number of them through philanthropic bodies or individuals. I've had individuals who've supported some of my students. One example is a Professor Michael Dickinson. He's in his early 40s, but he had one person sponsor him for 5 years through the foundation. And now he runs one of the biggest programs in Australia with these new immune therapies. He didn't have that funding. He would have been scrambling, and even he would admit he probably wouldn't be where he is. So I don't know how I got back around onto that, but the importance of research, it drags you in.
Something that I was going to get to further when we were chatting, but I'll ask the question now, is outside of your daily routine of treating patients and helping people with blood cancer, research has played a major role in your path to date, hasn't it? You've been heavily involved in research.
Yeah, I've covered what we call fundamental or basic research, which is being involved in really lab experiments. So one example is that I have a particular clinical interest in a type of lymphoma called T-cell lymphomas. They're quite rare, and over the years I've built up expertise. And people ring me up and ask me about difficult patients, and we have clinics around these lymphomas. And then we soon discovered a few years ago this thing called breast implant lymphoma, which is where women who have breast implants of a particular type can get a lymphoma. Very rare. There's less than 1,000 cases in the world, but the risk with particular type of implants is like 1 in 3,000. That's huge. But we had no idea what causes this. So my research has been working with people to find out about these cancers, but also we've got a big program of taking those cells from the patients when they're diagnosed, putting in the laboratory, and we've just been spent the last 3 years looking at the individual genetic data on those cells. So taking individual cells to work out why a breast implant can cause lymphoma. And so I have a person involved in the lab and then a postdoc and a PhD who are all doing those laboratory experiments. So we sit there and we talk about the basic, but a lot of it is driven what we call translational research. It's coming from a clinical thing back to the lab, make the discovery, and then you try and feed that back to the patient treatment. And so what we ended up finding was that we found out what causes them, and a number of implants ended up being withdrawn from the market. So thousands of implants got shut down because of these findings. And that's basically from research, and it all happened within a cycle of about 4 years. So you end up saying, well, that research is going to die, but that's because you've actually solved the problem.
Found a solution to the problem. Yeah. In the introduction, Director of Molecular Oncology and Cancer Immunology, for the people out there that are listening that don't understand what that means, if we could break it down and simplify it, you're diagnosing, you're researching, you're treating blood cancer. Can you explain to me, in simple terms, what is blood cancer?
So blood cancer is, by definition, an uncontrolled growth. So what unifies all cancers, whether that be a breast cancer or a bowel cancer, is that the local cells in that particular organ are growing in an uncontrolled way. So normally our fingernails should grow at the same speed, our hair should grow at the same speed. If you cut yourself, you should heal. And so it's all about an uncontrolled growth. With blood cancers, the cells that are abnormal are the white blood cells. So in our blood, we have predominantly 3 types of cells. Red cells, which carry oxygen, and then these white cells that fight infection. So the white cell's job is like the military, to kill bacteria, viruses, fungus, parasites, anything that's coming in the body from any direction. And so these white cells are like the military in the same way there's an army, an air force, a navy. So there's neutrophils, basophils, lymphocytes, macrophages, different types of white cells that kill in different ways. And so normally those white cells should be controlled, like a heater and a thermostat. You get a sore throat. What happens is that the reason the glands go up and you get a sore throat and can't swallow is because those white cells are replicating in a controlled way, go off, fight the infection, and it should, like a heater and a thermostat, switch off and then return to normal. But what happens in cancer, these white cells keep growing, and so they keep multiplying. And most importantly, they don't want to die, so they're relatively immortal. So blood cancers are any cancer that affects white blood cells, and it can be any different type, the army, the air force, or whatever. So leukemia is a blood cancer of white cells that's predominantly in the bone marrow. Leukemia literally means white blood, but it's predominantly a bone marrow disorder. So the bone marrow is in the bones. So the vertebra is like a honeycomb with stacks of bones, and in that honeycomb is where the blood is. So the bone marrow is the area where that honeycomb is. If you get an overgrowth of white cells in the bone marrow and they spill out in the blood, that's leukemia. And what happens is that those leukemic cells take over the bone marrow like weeds in the garden. So the normal cells just are not produced, and this just takes over, and people get bone marrow failure. They can't fight infections because their white cells are not working. They can't produce red blood cells, so they get short of breath, and they can't produce these things called platelets, which is the glue in the blood, so they bleed. Lymphoma, which is the other major type, is where it's the glands, the secondary home, which is glands in the neck, under the arms, these fatty glands where normally the white cells live. They're a bit like an ant's nest. If you cut yourself in the garden, the lymphocytes go from your gland in your armpit and go down to your tip of your finger, drag it back in there and process that. And then myeloma is the third biggest one, and that's a disease of the bone marrow as well, but it also destroys the immune system. And so it can cause bone problems. And so leukemia, lymphoma, and myeloma are the three major blood cancers. Together, they make up the fourth most common group of cancers. So you have breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer. You've got blood cancers in there as the fourth most common together. And so it's amazingly, when I talk to patients about blood cancer, they say, I've never seen it before. I've never heard of them. And then soon enough, they recognize that so many of their friends have got some form of blood cancer. The unifying thing with all those blood cancers is that they're just different types of white blood cells.
Is there an age group or a gender that people should be looking at, or is it non-discriminatory blood cancer?
Generally, it's not gender specific, but they're different ages, different cancers predominate. So, for example, childhood leukemia is quite common under the age of 10. Hodgkin's disease is a disease of young adults, and then often leukemias are in patients in their 40s and 50s. But unlike many other cancers, blood cancers are not caused by external agents generally considered. So there's nothing that predisposes them. So smoking, drinking, exposure to chemicals, etc., does not seem to have increased the risk for patients with blood cancer. So it's very random. Sitting where you are, patients will often say, but what have I done? Why me? Why have I got it? And it's largely because we produce about 1 trillion blood cells a day. So there's a lot of opportunity for mistakes there. The immune system is there to stop those mistakes. Once they arise, to sort of stop them developing further. But if they break through the immune system or escape, then you get that blood cancer. So a lot of them are due to these spontaneous errors that occur very, very randomly. And that's in many ways why we can cure them, because lightning often doesn't usually strike twice. So if we can cure that patient's Hodgkin's disease at the age of 25, they'll live till they're 80 and never get Hodgkin's again, because it was just a bad luck, spontaneous error.
Okay. You mentioned the different types of cancers and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Myeloma being that I had read the second most common blood cancer, makes up about 1.6% of all cancers. I'm not sure after what you've said that is accurate. There's around 20,000 Australians living with myeloma, with 2,330 new cases diagnosed and 1,000 deaths each year. They're pretty serious numbers, aren't they? Do we know what causes it? You've said before there's no real correlation between alcohol, smoking, chemicals and blood cancer. Has research shown you to date what does cause it?
No. It's really tricky. It's really tricky and frustrating for the individual and frustrating for us. And I don't know if we'll ever really know what causes it, because I don't think I've ever had anyone walk through the door where it's been blatantly obvious that this is the exposure or this is the thing. They've certainly become much more common since the Industrial Revolution. Myeloma has. So there's a suggestion, but there could be so many things. It could be, for example, if it's a virus or there's some viral element, that could be because people are living closer together. It doesn't necessarily mean it's pollutants. It just could mean that we're living in cities where we can pass these things on more readily.
Transmit more readily.
And we just don't know what it is. So something makes the cells go berserk. No, we don't know. I don't think we'll ever really get a very clear idea of what causes these blood cancers. It's very spontaneous. And it's not unusual, though. Pancreatic cancer, for example, it's really hard to know. It's very hard to pinpoint why did that particular person get it.
I'm looking forward to talking to you about your research as we continue to move forward. But just your commentary then around you don't know that there will ever be research that shows why it starts. Does that mean your focus in research moving forward is really about how the cure looks rather than prevention?
I think in blood cancers, prevention is going to have a limited role. I think that we might be able to screen. So we know a lot of the problems that arise. So it's a bit like a flat tire. You can have a flat tire. We can work out, that's a nail. But you try and work out where that nail came from, how that got in there, and what was required to get that nail in that particular position at that time to punch into that tire. And it's very hard to track that back. But I can tell you it's a nail. I can tell you the mechanism of which that nail went through the rubber and then and you could work out the speed at which the tire. So we know a lot about the molecular mechanisms of what the processes are going wrong within the cell. But what lit the match, we don't know. So we may get to points where we can screen for things by looking at individual cells in the body and say, this person, we can profile this person and things are going wrong. And therefore you are at risk of developing this sort of cancer. And we might find things that will modify it. Particularly, there are aspects of the immune system that if you keep your immune system optimized, and I'm not an expert in this, but there's more information. For example, the gut microbiome, what you eat or what you eat properly or don't properly, we know does affect how your body's immune system responds to some of the new drugs. So we may be able to modify things. We may be able to change things, but we may not know what that original event was that triggered it in that, and we may not be able to prevent that.
So prevention's really hard. How does it present early days in people? What can they look for? How does blood cancer present when you've got it? Or do you simply not know you've got it until you're that ill? You start doing tests on people and that's...
I think it's more like the latter. A lot of the time it's just either picked up by luck. Sometimes it takes a long time because the penny doesn't drop by the doctor. So, for example, in myeloma, one of the things it damages is the bones. And so the classic story of someone's had a back pain, gone to the chiropractor and taken 6 months before an x-ray's been done or a scan, and then the myeloma's picked up. But the classic is infections. When, as I was describing the weeds in the garden, the first thing that's taken over is your ability to fight infections. So that's a common presentation. So if people are getting recurrent infections or ones that are not healing. And then there's the classic sort of fevers, sweats that occur in what we call constitutional symptoms, where people with Hodgkin's disease, for example, and a lump in the neck, under the arm, that sort of thing.
So I would imagine there's a real tug of war with you in your journey, your career moving forward, where there's these patients that are really sick that desperately need your help. And yet it takes a brilliant mind like yours to be able to be really deeply integrated into that research process so that you can find a cure. How do you balance your time between looking after those that are sick and investing your time in trying to find a cure so that people don't get sick?
Yeah, so I think that's what makes it enjoyable as well. I mean, I still spend 80% of my day, of my working week, should I say, seeing patients. So I just love seeing patients and I love sharing the stories. And some of the patients have very simple problems. And sometimes patients will say, I think I'm wasting your time here. They're never wasting my time, but they think you should be looking after more important people. And it's always that these things need to be often found. So I love the searching for the cause of something. So that slightly detective work. And then a lot of it is about keeping up to date. So all of the good specialists have to keep up to date. You can't turn into a dinosaur. And I think that's the hardest part in medicine, is that just being in front of it all and going to the meetings and doing all of that. The education, internal education, that's required for everybody who's going to do this sort of work. And the third, though, is actually doing the research. So all of us who've done well in research have focused in one area. So if you look at anybody of my colleagues who have done research successfully, they haven't been doing 20 things over the years. They've tended to focus on a few things. And in my area, it's been immunology. And I suppose, luckily enough, what's happened is that since I got back in 1999, we've gone leaps and bounds in working out how the immune system fails in cancer growth, how it's one of the first victims, the first cities to fall as a cancer grows, is the immune system, and then ways in which we can get that immune system to rebuild it, to fight the cancers, has been my area. And so I've been able to, because it's a more generic thing, it's rather than just one specific disease or one specific pathway or whatever, you're getting your fingers in a lot of pies that way, and you can be involved. And so I found that really been fortunate, but it is the way to the future. I mean, all of the young science students that are coming through, they want to do immunology. They want to understand how the immune system works. So how do I find the time? I just work a lot.
You mentioned before as well, there's been some amazing people that have achieved some really incredible results in the research field with cancer, and you are absolutely one of them. And I guess that would have been really rewarding for you to be recognised with the Order of Australia in 2014 for your role in cancer research. You must be incredibly proud.
I think that whenever people say, what do you think of your award, they talk about everybody around them, and that's true. I think that you have to take, at some point, you have to take a stand and bang the table and say and believe in what you're doing. And I think those sorts of awards are very important to have in our community. Yeah, I'm very proud to have them, but I think what's helped me along the way is that It gives you some kudos when you meet people. It's very helpful in the philanthropic setting when they can say, okay, well, you're card carrying, you've done some work, you're recognised by your peers. They've done a bit of due diligence simply by having that, and they say, okay, can trust some of the things that he's saying. It's been very helpful that way.
I've read that you find most difficult, or one of the things you find most difficult about your journey is about blood cancer is giving a patient some idea of what your expectations are for them in terms of life expectancy, quality of life and treatment options. And it's a bit of a loaded question. It goes back to what you said before about speed dating and a long journey, a long relationship with your clients. And something that I've asked people before that are involved in fields like yourself with cancer treatment and things like that, is that it must be incredibly rewarding when you have success and you do find we hit milestones with research and things like that. There's a very different side to this journey that you're on as well, and that's this emotional journey that you must go on with patients as they go through their treatment. And you do have some successes, but also with cancer, there's a lot of people that don't survive cancer, and you've been on that journey with a lot of them. How do you emotionally detach yourself from that journey, or do you simply not?
I simply not. I think I gave up on trying to detach myself a long time ago. I think that you have to really do two things. One, you've got to demonstrate that you're trying your hardest and that you really care about them. And what frustrates people when they're vulnerable is when they feel like they're just low on the priority list. And so you have to make people high on the priority list. I mean, you can see in front of me, I've got bits of paper with different people's names all over them. And I've got to deal with that during the day. And I can't just say, oh, well, I'll deal with that in 2 weeks or not deal with it at all. You've signed up with them to make sure that you're looking after them. And that's the second point, as if they're family. And so I don't push with people. We talk about friendships. I let them know what's happening in my life. They're often interested in me. They don't ask questions. They'll say, oh God, you look tired, or they'll make quite personal connections, and you let them do that. And I've had situations where people have asked me to do things that are moderately, you think that could be crossing the border, crossing the line, but I do it. If it's appropriate, I'll do something that's relatively social with those patients. I found working in the philanthropic space with that has allowed that to do more. But I had one patient who, as part of the Snowdome Foundation, he ran from Melbourne to Echuca. His mum died 10 years earlier. She was diagnosed at 35 with myeloma. The average survival at that time was 3 years. She died at the age of 50, just a few weeks after her 50th birthday. Her kids went from 4 years to their mid-20s during that time, from 4 years old to 20, and then some of them in their mid-20s. And I've stayed friends with them, stayed friends with the husband and the kids, and I've seen the kids regularly. And that sort of friendship, that bond of looking after Sally for 15 years and going through all of the ups and downs, and she was saved by research, no question. She got a lot longer by clinical research and clinical trials. But that one story alone, and now Alistair, the son who ran, he emailed me the other day and said, look, he's sort of giving up going into fund management and he wants to do something in the philanthropic space. Have we got some ideas? And what would you do in Sydney? And that just shows what sort of bond you can have with patients or people as they go along. They move from patients to people and patients again. And so I think that you have to recognise that there are always some boundaries, but I can't push myself away or separate myself from those. And it is, I get very upset. My people, my friends, family know when I'm thinking about something else. Or I've got a phone call where I've got a bad result and my mood changes, my whole weekend changes, that you have to manage that.
Something you said before about, I asked you, you're doing all these works, you're involved in so many things. How do you get it done? And you said you simply keep working. So you've got a massive workload. You've now said that you have an inability to emotionally detach from this journey that you're on and this workload that you're entrenched in. You've got your 2 daughters at home. You've got Nina and Sophie. I guess I don't want to harp this point about not being able to emotionally detach yourself, but this would be a huge burden at times. I mean, you've got the story of Sally, and that's a beautiful story, but I would imagine there's a whole heap of stories that you could tell that haven't worked out that way. How do you integrate your career into work-life balance with your family at home? I mean, you touched on it then. Your family knows when, but can you switch off on weekends? You sit on various boards. You're heavily involved in your career. How do you find a bit of balance?
Well, I don't think there is balance. I think that there are a lot of sacrifices, and glibly people say that these sorts of approaches are vocation. And yeah, there's been regrets along the way in terms of the family. no doubt. And fortunately, my two daughters are not medical. Sophie she's just got a new position as Assistant Curator of Indigenous Arts at National Gallery. So couldn't get any further away from a person who grew up in Geelong and then coming to Melbourne. So the sorts of people that my girls are very, very different. And that's congratulations to her mother who gave them a whole lot of this other stuff. And so travelling, walking the beach, throwing a stick for the dog, and playing a lot of sport and going to the gym a few times a week. That's my escape time. But, have I got a wide range of friends and can I socialise widely? And other than barracking for the Geelong Football Club and going to a few games like that, yeah, those are the things that limit you. But, the lucky thing is that there's a fair bit of travel in there, and I do tend to chill and have that quiet time. But I don't think you can pretend you can actually have a really balance. We're all a bit odd. We're all a bit strange.
I did notice that Geelong jersey over your shoulder at the start, and being an avid St Kilda supporter, it took me a little while to warm up. Yeah, they beat us in the grand final. I've never looked at St Kilda supporters the same way ever again.
I know, you can blame that.
Mill.
Yes, you can blame one hitting the post. Most St Kilda supporters do.
And then we went on to lose another, draw one and lose one to Collingwood. We've talked about this journey that you're on. I've read that your holy grail as a clinician is to have chemotherapy-free treatment. So patients go through their disease treatment, whether it's myeloma or any other blood cancer, without having chemotherapy. Is that a reality?
Yep, definitely. So I have patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia and multiple myeloma who spend their whole time on managing their disease now without chemotherapy. So when I started this as a haematology registrar in the late 80s, we only had one drug for myeloma. It was called melphalan. We've now got 15 drugs, and most of them are not chemotherapy. Because luckily, once you hit the Achilles heel of some of these blood cancers, then a lot of research and discoveries get made downstream. It allows it to focus. And so I draw the parallel of having a bank of light switches when you walk into a hotel or a big room and there's 8 switches. Which one is going to be the one that drives the problem? And there are a lot of switches in cancer which are not drivers. They're sort of passengers in the process of cancer disruption. And so once you discover the switch, then you can work out a whole lot of other ways of switching it off. So chemotherapy is really important, but ultimately it's a poison. It's relying on cells dividing. So some cancers don't divide very much. They're very dormant. So killing them is quite hard with chemo because chemo works by one cell becoming 2, 2 becoming 4. And during that process is where they're vulnerable, when they're producing lots of DNA and they're about to split apart. Then you can throw the spanner in the motor with chemotherapy, and then those cells can't multiply and they die. But if you've got a cell that's actually growing and cancerous because it doesn't want to die, it's just sitting there and it's accumulating just very slowly over a period of months to years, then you want to make those cells commit suicide. And so there's a whole process of what's called programmed cell death. So the cells should die. They should be like a leaf on a tree or a moth or whatever. They should die, but they don't want to. So they're squishing out the garden by simply growing. So we now have drugs that can reverse that process, very targeted therapies. And so the new way forward is trying to make those cells commit suicide. But similarly, the other big area is using the body's immune system. So making the body think that those cancer cells are like a bacteria or a virus. And so if you get a tetanus vaccine as a kid, your body remembers it. Then 10 years later, you stand on a rusty nail and you're down at the farm and the tetanus bacteria gets in, your white cells go, I've seen that. They produce these antibodies, these fork-like proteins that bind onto the bacteria and kill it. We can now do the same for cancers, one type of immune therapy. So the combination of targeted agents, biological agents, that understanding where the cell's defenses are and how it's surviving, or anti-survival drugs, and the immune system have revolutionized. They're the two big changes. And they've changed largely because of our understanding of the genetics. And that's what the term molecular comes in, molecular oncology, which is about understanding the mutations and what's driving the cell. And why we can now, with computerization, we can analyze people's DNA genetics very, very quickly. We couldn't have done this back in the 60s simply because you couldn't deal with the masses of information. So biology has been rewarded and allowed to move forward because of computational advances, dealing with terabytes of information. One wouldn't happen without the other.
And the podcast, obviously, The Hidden Philanthropist, is exactly that. It's going out there and talking to people about their philanthropic journey. In your case, I think today it was as equally as important, or if not more important, to shine a light on you as Professor Miles Prince and the incredible work that you've done. But you're right, you sit on various boards, and one of them is the Snowdome Foundation, and that was one of the things following talking about you and what your journey looks like is about the Snowdome Foundation. Talk to me a bit about the foundation. What does it do?
So look, the Snowdome Foundation is just over 10 years old. We've raised just over $50 million in that time, basically to accelerate new therapies for patients with blood cancers. That's our mission, is that we want to bring new treatments to patients with blood cancers faster, because ultimately for everybody, it's too slow. Most people do relapse. So 3 of us set it up 11 years ago. There was Rob Tandy, whose father had myeloma, Grant Rutherford, whose daughter Chloe, and the name comes from Chloe in that she saw all of these snowdomes when she was in hospital at the age of 9, having treatment for acute leukemia, and she went past the nurse's station and saw these snowdomes and thought it was a fairyland. So we wanted a name that was a little bit obscure, didn't talk about cancers all the time, didn't have that as a focus. So when I went to Chloe's funeral, I saw the table with all of the snowdomes, and when we talked a few months later about doing something for blood cancers, we wanted to come up with a name, and Grant is in advertising, and I came up with the name Snowdome, and as Grant says, it can be retrofitted in so many ways. It is about the individual. So the foundation is focused on new treatments and looking at innovative ways, and we have been supporting some big projects, particularly in immune system, looking at ways that we can bring these treatments to patients with blood cancers, because everything is just too slow. And what's happened and the success of the organisation has been, one, we're very lean. We get a lot of support from other foundations or other individuals to support our infrastructure. So we just had our annual general meeting last night. We run at a 15% expenses ratio.
It's incredible.
So that's because of support from other people to fund that. And we're getting recurrent support because people can see the advances that we're making. We've funded over 60 clinical trials. We've had 35 individual researchers, the young people who are doing the cutting edge stuff. We've had people who've won the Minister's Prize, numerous prizes, but proudest of all to us all is the new treatments that we're getting to these people. And you can see it all the time. And we do presentations frequently to our donors about how we had one donor, Bruce Wilson, who's from Reese, and he supported the Wilson Centre at Peter Mac to over $7 million. And he met another Bruce who happened to be a cardiothoracic surgeon who was one of my mentors when I was there. And the second Bruce, the surgeon, had a brain lymphoma. And we genomically tested it. So we tested it not only in his brain, but more recently from blood testing, which has been one of the discoveries. And we were able to match the right drug to his brain lymphoma. And he's now been going for the last 6 years. He otherwise would have been dead 6 years ago. And these two guys met at one of our meeting of the two Bruces. But what Bruce Wilson and his family could see was they literally, the dollars that they would have spent on something had literally saved this man's life and has led to exploring that avenue to treat other people. So translational research, it's hard work, but we're lucky where we are in Australia. So that's the Snowdome Foundation really wants to grow, maintaining its focus on these new therapies. So we've got some big projects that are multi-million-dollar projects that we want to get funded over the next few years, and that's our priority.
Okay, so for the people that are out there that can give, and we'll wrap it up shortly, we'll direct them in a minute. There's so many charities out there that do what you mentioned earlier. They provide transport, they provide toys, they provide happy events and occasions for people that are dealing with cancer. You're the total opposite of that, aren't you? You've raised $50 million. It's a lot of money. It's all going into research for the prevention and the cure of blood cancer, or in cancer in general.
Yes, and so our focus is on putting people into that because, quite simply, if we've got a drug we know that works, it's not on the PBS, we know that it's going to save probably 30 or 50 people's lives in Australia if we have the right protocol. All we need is a person who will be writing these drug protocols. It's very easy for me to fly or Zoom to Roche or Novartis or BMS or all of these companies and say, we've got a great idea. I had one on the weekend. Write the protocol for us and we'll give you the drug. We'll get the trial going. We just need some money, right? So it costs about $10,000 to put a patient on a clinical trial in terms of the added costs outside of the drug. It's not a lot of money to save someone's life. All up, these clinical trials cost $1 million to run. depending on size, of course, but it's about the people. And then the person who writes the trial, the Mike Dickinson I talked about before, the young man or the young woman who's we support at the Wehi, he are set up for the rest of their lives to do more work in that area. And that's really one of the perpetual aspects of the foundation so what happens is that the donors really enjoy meeting the fellows, meeting the researchers, getting excited about what gets them up in the morning, why they continue to do this, why they do all the sacrifices that we talked about. It really is enriching the whole population. That's unfortunately the problem with a system which does not engender a research environment, but we can do it. We can do it relatively efficiently.
And what do you think the charities of your foundation's ability to be able to raise that sort of money moving forward in the philanthropic space, is it something that you're continuing to have success with, or is it a real challenge?
I think it's all about time and spending the time with the people. For every 5 people we talk to, we probably get one that's a big winner. And so, it's a lot of time and effort and getting people on the journey. When we've got people who've supported us, they continue to support us. But it's bloody hard. I love to talk to people about it. We all find it a bit awkward about asking for money, but that's why foundations work and do it so well, is that we have to build that story so we're not uncomfortable about asking for it. But we've got projects. We're doing one in immunotherapy at the moment, and we know we've got a $5 million project, and we're $2.5 million there. We've said it's half funded by the Epworth. They've put in $5 million. Snowdome's committed to put in the $5 million. We'll get there, but we're $2.5 million in. We need another $2.5 million over 3 years. So it keeps me up at night. There's a lot of people who are in that and working in that. It's just all so slow, because I know that if you had that tomorrow, you'd be working on the next thing and becomes perpetual. So we look very actively at other government support, how we can make this a viable research and money-making or money-supporting venture. So all of those things are part of the strategy, that they have to be self-funding, self-supporting down the track.
You mentioned before how bloody hard it is. World Cancer Day will be held on May the 28th in 2023. September's designated as a Blood Cancer Awareness Month. How significant are these dates for fundraising, and how do you get these initiated and up and running and become part of our society psyche?
Well, I think you have to commit to that being part of your agenda when you're a foundation. So any foundation has to have all of the boring bits. Make sure that you're running a proper business. I mean, Snowdome Foundation are fortunate in that we won Small Charity of the Year. Last year, we won the Telstra Award because we're a good business. We tick all the boxes that make people feel safe about investing. Everything from the database, stop us being hacked, all of our risk systems, all of those things have to be run. And then you do the more important stuff about looking at how do you spread the word and how do you use social media? What's the best way of getting your message across? I would love Snowdome to be the Beyond Blue to blood cancers. That's really one of the aims, is for it to be associated with its place in blood cancers. And so we are known really well by the government. They know who Snowdome is. The universities know who Snowdome is, both all the universities, all the researchers. That's been a build-up in the 10 years. So getting our name known is a constant issue, but it's also getting our name known is important, because then people can trust us, and then we link that clearly with the message, and that message can be delivered on those important dates, like you said. So we use September very effectively with a lot of podcasts and information to draw people's attention at the time. I think they are definitely important, and we should be having other ways in which we can focus people's attention, because keeping people's attention, you've hit it on the head. It's really hard to do.
And for the people that are listening that have been touched by and affected by blood cancer through their family, themselves, all those sorts of things, how can we get them to engage with the Snowdome Foundation?
Well, I think the most important thing is that every cent counts. So pretty much my view is that Einstein came up with E equals MC squared, which is about time and how to speed up time. When I talk to my patients about their cancer, all they want is more time. They see it as a fight against time. If they can hang around a bit longer, there will be new discoveries. And that happens all the time. So I think the first thing to say is people need to be very optimistic that things are changing. It just needs to speed up time. And to speed up time, adding on to Einstein's theory, is actually money. Money into research reduces the time to get these to patients. So if it's 5 cents or $500,000, it's all going to contribute to putting together projects that will make a difference. And so we don't do projects that don't make a difference. How do they engage? Well, we have a website, snowdome.org. You can just Google on Snowdome Foundation and you'll find us very easily. And we do need support and money for the projects. We have volunteers involved in the organisation, but we don't have that many events. We have some key events, but we do need people to help us with various things. A lot of those people have been touched by blood cancers. And I think have a look at the website, see if you're interested. I think it is a challenge with a relatively small organisation to deal with a lot of volunteers. So it's a small number. We really need the support. Or if there are people that those people know that might be interested in supporting us, that speak to them, let them know about the Snowdome Foundation.
Professor Miles Prince, you mentioned before the most important thing is time. Thank you for your time today. It's been an absolute privilege to sit down and talk with you. And it's been a great insight into your mind and the amazing work you do. Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, mate. A huge thank you to Professor Miles Prince. How you found the time to talk to us today, I'll never know. However, you gave of your energy and you shared your story to inspire our listeners in the art of giving back. To learn more about the Snowdome Foundation and how you can support their cause, check out our show notes for contact details.
To learn more about the art of giving back in whatever way you can, visit our website andrewpurdie.com.au and follow us on Instagram, The Hidden Philanthropist. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdie Foundation.